Hollywood historical blockbusters always end at the most exciting, yet completely implausible moment. The hero dramatically sheathes his bloodied sword, epic victory music swells, and the audience breathes a sigh of relief. We're shown the surviving soldiers joyfully hugging each other against the backdrop of a picturesque sunset, as if they've just won a school rugby match. But the real story of harsh antiquity begins the very second the director usually shouts, "Cut!" Most people today sincerely believe that the immediate chaos of close combat is the most terrifying ordeal of war, but the 48 hours of grueling, routine work that followed victory were guaranteed to break the spirit of even the most hardened veterans. Just imagine that the legionnaires had to clean up not ordinary construction debris, but the horrific consequences of human cruelty on an industrial scale. It sounds like a grim scenario for a horror movie, but for the Romans, it was a routine part of their daily duties. Today we'll talk in great detail about those harsh realities that official academic history textbooks shyly and stubbornly keep silent about. We'll examine in detail exactly how the meticulous Romans divided their war booty, whom they tried to save, and whom they cold-bloodedly sent to the afterlife. It was an incredibly grueling routine, thoroughly saturated with the smell of iron and sweat, having absolutely nothing in common with a beautiful, heroic epic. And to be honest, some of the deeply practical details of ancient military life will make you truly shudder with genuine surprise. Get comfortable in front of your bright screens, because we're heading straight to the site of the ancient world's bloodiest massacre. The sun is slowly setting on the horizon, but for the gasping, exhausted, surviving soldiers, the grueling workday is only just beginning. My shoulders start to ache involuntarily, just as I try to imagine the sheer magnitude of that monstrous physical labor. It sounds incredibly wild for our times, doesn't it? The ringing silence after a massive battle is perhaps the loudest and most terrifying sound in the whole wide world. Just a pitiful minute ago, thousands of furious men were screaming at the top of their lungs, and now only muffled death throes echo across the field. The stern Roman commanders never gave their exhausted soldiers extra time to fully process the horror of what had happened. Immediately after the final victory cry, a methodical, almost robotic sweep of the captured territory began on the blood-soaked ground. The first priority was to urgently restore the strict battle order of the legions, which had been disrupted in the chaos of the brutal slaughter. In our modern world, a fully equipped elite special forces unit can take roll call over a secure radio in literally a couple of short seconds. The exhausted legionnaires had to physically search for their horse centurions amid a veritable sea of sticky mud, broken weapons, and bodies. If you miraculously survived this terrible meat grinder, you were obliged to return to your ranks immediately and without further ado. Pushed to the absolute limits of physical exhaustion, the men obediently lined up in even, perfectly disciplined rows. They had just been swinging heavy iron swords non-stop for several endless hours in a row. My hands start to tremble treacherously from fatigue just thinking about such a crazy cardio workout. And these tough guys, without the slightest exaggeration, still had a whole long night of grueling drudgery ahead of them. But this is where it gets really interesting, because the cautious Romans never let their guard down on enemy territory. The enemy cavalry could return unexpectedly, or fresh reinforcements hidden in the dense forest could strike treacherously from behind. That is precisely why a significant portion of the surviving troops immediately took up strong defensive positions along the entire perimeter of the blood-soaked field. The Romans always coolly anticipated the worst-case scenario, and this professional paranoia regularly saved their lives. The remaining legionaries laboriously removed their dented helmets just to wipe away the stinging sweat, but they did not let go of their personal weapons from their calloused hands. The feeling of complete safety was the greatest and deadliest illusion of any brutal ancient war. You could heroically survive a furious frontal assault by savage Gauls, but be absurdly struck by a rusty arrow from an enemy feigning death. And the seasoned, hardened veterans of the legions understood this most important basic rule of survival perfectly well. At that very moment, the stern officers began their initial and utterly cynical mathematical tally of human losses. This was the famous, unyielding Roman bureaucracy in its bleakest and most terrifying practical manifestation. Centurions with stony faces walked among the orderly ranks, dryly noting on their tablets who was still standing and who was already missing. Your modern, stuffy office with its tedious quarterly reports seems like a veritable paradise compared to this bloody inventory. Those lucky few who could still stand on their own were given a brief but vital respite to quench their thirst. The thirst was so agonizing and intense, it felt as though you'd been wandering through a scorching desert for a whole week without a single flask of water. In that brief moment, they were given that very same pascu, a sharp mixture of plain water and cheap wine vinegar. It tasted like spoiled kebab marinade, but this sour liquid was perfect for preventing dehydration and killing bacteria. But of course, none of the high-ranking officers allowed the soldiers to sit on the damp ground and rest for too long. The Roman army always operated like a huge, well-oiled machine, and it was strictly forbidden for such an expensive mechanism to stand idle. Literally half an hour after the battle had finally ended, the commander's new abrupt orders rang out piercingly across the field. The most disgusting, physically grueling, and filthy part of a soldier's daily routine was about to begin. You had just professionally killed other people while in a state of intense adrenaline rush and battle rage. Now you had to do practically the same thing, but with a completely cool and calculating head. And this monotonous process objectively demanded a completely different, much higher level of psychological resilience. Modern trendy psychotherapists would unambiguously call such actions a deeply traumatic and destructive experience. The Romans, however, simply and matter-of-factly called it their direct, daily, and inescapable professional duties. In their harsh ancient world, there was no restorative therapy, no cozy offices, and no long conversations about personal feelings. You silently took your trusty short gladius and obediently went to carry out the next stage of this ruthless ancient logistics. And take my word for it, this next inevitable stage was truly terrifying. The first task of the special funeral squad sounded frighteningly pragmatic and was called clearing the battlefield of the wounded. When tens of thousands of people are hacking at each other with swords, not every blow proves instantly fatal. The battlefield was literally littered with hundreds of soldiers from both opposing sides, screaming in unbearable pain and bleeding to death. And something urgent and drastic had to be done about this horrifying mass of suffering people. For Roman legionaries, this was not senseless cruelty, but a cold and mathematically precise calculation of survival. If an enemy warrior was wounded too severely, no one was going to waste precious medicines and doctor's time on him. A weary soldier would simply approach him and deliver a single swift, professionally executed merciful blow. Under modern law, this is unequivocally considered a grave war crime. But back then, it was an act of grim humanism. But here's what's truly astonishing about this nightmarish and cynical procedure of the ancient post-war era. The Romans treated their own severely wounded comrades in arms in exactly the same way. If a legionary suffered a terrible wound to the abdomen that ancient medicine was guaranteed to be unable to suture, his fate was sealed. A comrade would simply slit his throat to spare him several days of agonizing suffering from infection. This sounds completely unthinkable to our warm, comfortable, and protected modern society. We are accustomed to fighting for every human life, right down to the very last ventilator in the ICU. The Romans thought in entirely different terms, where a quick death at the hands of a friend was considered the highest expression of a soldier's honor. They viewed it as the final service one warrior could render to his dying comrade in arms. At the same time, the mopping up process required extreme concentration, for a wounded enemy often remained deadly dangerous. Many defeated barbarians deliberately feigned death, clutching short daggers hidden beneath their bodies in their weakening hands. They knew full well that they would be finished off anyway, and wanted to take at least one Roman with them to the afterlife. Therefore, the legionaries checked the bodies with extreme caution, often using long spears to ensure their safety. Modern occupational safety experts would be horrified by such risky working conditions. You walk across grass slippery with blood, risking a sword strike to your unprotected leg at any moment. That is precisely why the mop-up teams always worked in coordinated pairs, constantly covering each other's backs. One soldier carefully examined a suspicious body lying on the ground, while the other held his shield at the ready to instantly repel a possible attack. Meanwhile, a special detachment of centurions carefully examined the bodies of the enemy army's slain and wounded commanders. If they managed to find a noble leader still alive, they would carefully bandage his wounds and spare his life. This was done not out of any sudden compassion, but solely for the sake of future political and financial gain. Noble prisoners could be exchanged for incredible gains or paraded triumphantly in chains through the streets of Rome. As for the enemy's ordinary infantrymen, no one even attempted to bandage their wounds or alleviate their suffering in any way. They were simply methodically stabbed with swords as the troops advanced across the field in a straight line, as if harvesting a terrible bloody crop. This gruesome work could go on for several hours until the moans on the field finally died down. And only after a complete deathly silence had fallen could the army move on to the next, far more pleasant phase. This phase was the very moment for which many poor men had enlisted in the harsh Roman legions in the first place. Having risked his one and only life and survived the meat grinder, a soldier had every legal right to financial compensation. A massive but strictly organized collection of valuables from the lifeless bodies of the defeated enemy would begin. And this process of looting was regulated in Rome better than the modern tax system. Most ancient armies at this point turned into an uncontrollable mob of greedy, ragged soldiers fighting over gold rings, but not the Romans, who managed to turn even the plundering of corpses into a tedious and strictly organized bureaucratic procedure. Discipline remained ironclad even when vast quantities of gold and precious weapons were at stake, and their system for dividing the spoils was truly ingenious in its cynical fairness. Let's clarify one very important point right away regarding the military ethics of ancient times. In the ancient world, taking valuables from a dead enemy was not considered shameful or immoral. On the contrary, it was a completely legal, expected, and honorable part of a soldier's earnings, much like a modern annual bonus. The only difference was that the Romans elevated this process to the status of an ideal state system. Among the Celts or Germanic tribes, a primitive law of the jungle usually prevailed after a victory. First come, first served. This regularly led to soldiers from the same army turning on each other over a beautiful, shiny helmet. Roman generals looked at this chaos and decided that such an inefficient system was categorically unsuitable for them. They introduced the strictest rules for collecting trophies, and legionaries could be beaten to death with sticks for violating them. Half the army would go to rest or build a fortified camp to ensure safety overnight. The other half would carefully enter the battlefield with the sole purpose of conducting an organized, centralized collection of all valuables. No one was allowed to hide found gold or valuable weapons in their deep pockets or under their armor. All items collected from the corpses were required to be brought to a single huge pile in the center of the commander's tent. It sounds like an ideal communist utopia, but it worked thanks to a primal fear of severe punishment. Centurions personally ensured that every blood-stained bracelet or silver buckle ended up in the common pot. If a soldier was caught trying to conceal even a small coin, a public and extremely painful execution awaited him. The Roman justice system was swift, ruthless, and absolutely intolerant of financial fraud by subordinates. But why was it necessary to gather everything into one common pile instead of simply distributing it to the people? Because Rome understood a great truth. Soldiers' contributions to the overall victory are never exactly the same. Some stood in the front line and took the most devastating blows on their shields, risking their lives every second. Others guarded the supply train in the rear and didn't even have time to properly dull their training swords. Dividing the spoils equally would have been a glaring injustice that would have quickly destroyed the morale of the elite units. Therefore, after all the trophies were collected, the real accounting work began under the strict supervision of a military tribune. All valuables were carefully appraised, weighed, and converted into monetary equivalents right there in the field. Your modern accounting department with its 1C software would simply be in tears at such an incredible speed of calculation. Next, the army commander personally distributed this massive haul according to a strict hierarchical ladder. The largest share, naturally, went to the general and the legion's senior officers, then the heroes of the battle, Those who were the first to storm enemy positions or save a comrade's life were generously rewarded. Ordinary infantrymen received their fixed share, depending on their years of service and military rank. Modern corporations call this a complex system of KPIs and bonus payments based on the results of a successful year. The Romans practiced this advanced method of financial motivation a couple of thousand years before the first business schools appeared. This system ensured that even a soldier left behind in the rear would receive his fair share of gold. In this way, the army avoided internal bloody conflicts and maintained its famous iron unity. However, the spoils consisted not only of mundane gold coins, precious stones, or silver jewelry. High-quality enemy weapons, heavy chainmail, and sturdy shields of the defeated foe were of immense value. And the Romans treated these specific iron trophies in a very special, deeply symbolic way. They did not simply melt them down for metal, but used them to create true monuments to their superiority. This process of creating military monuments right on the site of a brutal battle was a distinct form of ancient art. It served not only religious but also deeply psychological purposes, intended to intimidate all future enemies of Rome. What they did with the piles of enemy iron boggles the imagination with its monumental cruelty, and this terrifying ritual deserves our separate and very careful consideration. Once all the valuable items had been neatly sorted and fairly divided, mountains of iron remained on the battlefield. These were thousands of broken spears, bent swords, pierced helmets, and the enemy's chainmail torn to shreds. Hauling all this incredibly heavy metal junk along on a long campaign was a logistical madness. So the Romans devised a brilliant method of disposal that also served as a powerful propaganda tool. They selected the most beautiful and well-preserved weapons of their defeated enemies to create what was known as a trophium. It was a massive wooden cross or tree trunk on which the captured armor was ceremoniously hung. This structure looked like a gigantic, terrifying metal scarecrow towering right in the middle of a blood-soaked field. It symbolized Rome's unconditional victory and served as a grim warning to any potential rebels. Modern PR managers spend millions of dollars creating aggressive outdoor advertising to intimidate competitors. The Romans simply left behind a gruesome installation of blood-stained iron on the side of the main road. Any traveler or local passing by immediately understood, without needing to be told, who was in charge here. It was the most effective and absolutely free political advertisement in the history of the ancient world. The rest of the less attractive iron was gathered into huge piles and methodically destroyed so that it would not fall into enemy hands. Soldiers took heavy sledgehammers and deliberately bent blades, punched through shields, and broke spear shafts. Leaving functional weapons on the battlefield was strictly forbidden, as local peasants might rise up in revolt. Therefore, the legionaries spent long hours turning a deadly arsenal into useless scrap metal. But that is not the only oddity of the Roman accounting approach to the results of a bloody war. The finest and most unique examples of enemy weaponry were carefully packed for shipment to the capital. They were intended for the famous Roman triumph, a grand parade of victors through the streets of the Eternal City. These artifacts were meant to vividly demonstrate to the Roman plebs what a dangerous monster their valiant legions had defeated. Sometimes commanders specifically ordered that the most exotic items, such as war chariots or elephant tusks, be preserved. These items were then displayed for years in Roman temples as proof of the empire's greatness and that of its gods. Modern history museums operate on exactly the same principle of preserving significant cultural artifacts from the past. The only difference is that the curators of these ancient exhibitions were stern generals in blood-stained cloaks. Once all these bureaucratic and symbolic procedures were completed, it was time to tackle the most massive problem. Tens of thousands of dead bodies still lay scattered across the vast field, already beginning to decompose rapidly. And while the legionnaires gathered the gleaming gold and beautiful weapons with undisguised enthusiasm and joy, they approached the next stage of cleanup with deep revulsion and grim expressions. Imagine the task. You need to quickly and safely dispose of 40,000 human and horse corpses. You have no powerful excavators, no trucks, no chemical reagents, only human hands and shovels. This task seems absolutely impossible, but the Roman military machine handled it with frightening methodicalness. Let's take a look at exactly how they organized this grim sanitation of death. Clearing away thousands of decomposing corpses was not merely an unpleasant duty, but a matter of critical survival for the entire army. In the hot Mediterranean climate, the biological processes of decomposition began literally within a few hours of death. A Swedish, nauseating stench filled the entire area, attracting swarms of flies and wild scavengers from all around. Roman field doctors knew full well that invisible miasmas from rotting bodies carried deadly diseases and plague. Therefore, sanitizing the battlefield was considered the top priority immediately after collecting valuable trophies. In the modern world, special units of the Ministry of Emergency Situations in protective suits handle the cleanup of major disasters. Roman legionaries had no respirators. They simply wrapped their faces in pieces of cloth soaked in sour vinegar. This primitive mask at least somewhat masked the terrible stench and allowed the soldiers to remain conscious while working. First and foremost, the soldiers divided the dead into three strict categories: their own, enemies, and dead animals. The Romans always buried their fallen comrades with the utmost respect, observing all the prescribed religious rituals. Their bodies were carefully carried to a specially designated area where deep individual graves were already being dug. The names of the fallen legionaries were carefully recorded by scribes so that official notifications could later be sent to their grieving families in Italy. The attitude towards slain enemies was entirely different, extremely pragmatic and devoid of any unnecessary sentimentality. Naturally, no one intended to dig tens of thousands of individual graves for the defeated barbarians. That would have been a waste of effort. For them, they organized massive mass graves, giant pits into which the bodies were simply dumped by the thousands. Modern excavators take days to dig such trenches, but the Romans did it by hand in a single short night. The carcasses of slain war horses and huge pack animals littering the battlefield always posed a particular problem. A horse weighs nearly half a ton, and moving it without special equipment is practically impossible. Therefore, they often had to be butchered right on the spot or burned, surrounded by mountains of dry brush and wood. Huge bonfires of dead horses burned for days on end, creating thick, suffocating black smoke that blanketed the sky. Doctors closely monitored the soldiers to ensure they regularly washed their hands with water mixed with the same vinegar. It sounds like a strange and cheap dressing for a vegetable salad, but it worked as an excellent antiseptic. It turned out that ancient physicians had discovered the basic principles of disinfection through trial and error, thousands of years before the advent of microbiology. Those who disregarded these strict hygiene rules often died of dysentery a couple of weeks after the battle. Despite all this horrific burden, sanitary cleaning was strictly mandatory for every legion. No Roman general would dare to set up camp next to a rotting field of death. This risked a mutiny among the exhausted soldiers, who were already at the limits of their physical and mental endurance. Therefore, they dug deep trenches and hauled away the corpses until the area was relatively clean. Only after completing this colossal and gruesome task could the soldiers finally go and wash themselves. But the smell of blood and scorched flesh had seeped so deeply into their skin and hair that it wouldn't wash off for weeks. And in this grim context, we must discuss how they coped with their own losses. For in addition to the dead, thousands of severely wounded comrades remained in their care, requiring immediate assistance. The logistics of mass burials demanded no less skill from Roman engineers than the construction of impregnable fortresses. Choosing the right location for a massive mass grave was a complex task entrusted only to the most experienced surveyors. It was forbidden to dig near rivers or underground springs so that cadaveric poison would not contaminate the drinking water. Modern public health and epidemiological services use exactly the same principles when planning large urban cemeteries. The depth of the burial trenches had to be at least 3 meters to prevent the spread of the terrible stench. Excavating thousands of cubic meters of dense soil with shovels after an exhausting battle lasting many hours seems like a sophisticated form of torture. But Roman soldiers were accustomed to digging defensive ditches around their camp every day, so they had the skill. They viewed digging massive graves simply as another large-scale earthwork exercise to stay in shape. If the ground was too rocky or frozen, the legions resorted to an alternative method: mass cremation. Building giant funeral pyres required cutting down an entire forest, which was a separate and extremely complex logistical challenge. Soldiers had to fell hundreds of trees, cut them into even logs, and stacked them in neat geometric piles. Modern lumberjacks with chainsaws would have spent several days on such a task, but the Romans managed it in a single day. The cremation of their fallen legionnaires was conducted with the utmost solemnity and respect for military valor. Centurions dressed in ceremonial armor delivered long eulogies, listing the merits of each fallen hero. The flames of the enormous bonfires lit up the night sky for many kilometers around, creating a truly mystical and eerie atmosphere. The ashes were carefully collected in special clay urns to be later sent to the grieving relatives in Italy. Naturally, no ceremony was observed with the enemy corpses during cremation. They were burned in huge, shapeless piles. This was a purely utilitarian destruction of dangerous biomass, having nothing to do with a respectful funeral rite. Often, due to a shortage of dry firewood, the fires burned poorly, emitting an incredibly acrid and nauseating smoke of burnt flesh. This distinctive stench was forever etched into the memory of every ancient soldier, associated with the true cost of any victory. Interestingly, the ashes from these gigantic bonfires were later often used by local peasants as excellent fertilizer. A surprising irony of history, the site of a terrible massacre would, within a couple of years, turn into the most fertile wheat field. Nature quickly and mercilessly reclaimed what was hers, erasing all visible traces of human madness and political ambition. And by that time, the Roman legions were already marching hundreds of kilometers away, preparing for a new slaughter. During these massive earthworks, commanders kept a close watch on the morale of their exhausted men. Physical exhaustion, compounded by the gruesome sight of mangled bodies, could easily trigger panic or mass depression. Therefore, the centurions constantly shouted, gave sharp orders, and did not allow the soldiers a single second for gloomy thoughts. Constant engagement in heavy physical labor was the best ancient antidepressant, preventing nervous breakdowns. Those legionaries who showed weakness or refused to haul the stinking corpses were severely and publicly punished. They were deprived of their wine rations, put on half rations, or forced to do the dirtiest work in the camp. The Roman army tolerated neither individualism nor fragile mental constitution. You were simply a cog in a massive state machine. Your office job with free coffee seems like a resort compared to ancient personnel management. By the morning of the second day after a large-scale battle, the field was usually completely cleared of all visible corpses. Huge mounds of fresh earth and smoldering black ash were the only evidence of the recent grand tragedy. The army could finally breathe a small sigh of relief, though it was still too early to relax. One more crucial task lay ahead, requiring enormous resources and specialized medical knowledge. An ancient military hospital, or valetudinarum, consisted of a series of large tents permeated with the smell of blood and screams. At that time, there were no effective painkillers other than strong diluted wine or opium poppy extract. Therefore, most surgical procedures were performed on patients who were fully conscious and felt every movement of the scalpel. Strong orderlies would simply lean their full weight on the wounded soldier to keep him from moving during an amputation. The main threat to a wounded legionnaire was not the sword blow itself, but the inevitable infection and contamination that followed. Without modern antibiotics, any dirt that got into an open wound on the battlefield was guaranteed to lead to fatal gangrene. Roman doctors intuitively understood this and used boiled water, strong vinegar, and natural honey for disinfection. Honey possesses powerful natural antibacterial properties, and this sweet substance saved thousands of lives in antiquity. Roman surgical instruments look eerily similar to those we see in modern sterile operating rooms. They had scalpels, special tweezers for removing arrows, bone saws, and even clamps for bleeding vessels. Doctors were masters at suturing ruptured intestines, setting complex fractures, and performing successful trepanations on fractured skulls. Your local clinic would be proud of such a high level of surgical skill and practical trauma experience. The most difficult procedure was considered to be the proper removal of an enemy arrowhead or a spear fragment lodged in the body. The Celts often used special serrated arrowheads that tore through muscles when attempts were made to pull them out by conventional means. Roman physicians invented a clever instrument called the Diocles spoon, which gently gripped the tip while protecting the surrounding tissue. It was a masterpiece of ancient engineering, designed specifically to minimize damage during surgical procedures. Interestingly, doctors in the legions were deeply respected and received double a soldier's pay for their work. They were often educated Greeks who brought with them advanced medical treatises and knowledge of anatomy. They did not merely treat wounds, but also strictly monitored the overall quality of drinking water and the soldier's diet. In fact, they served as modern-day strict health inspectors, rigorously overseeing the daily life of the military base. The recovery process for the severely wounded took many months, during which they were exempted from heavy physical labor. The Roman state generously paid for their long-term treatment because an experienced veteran was worth his weight in gold. Training a new, inexperienced recruit cost far more than curing and returning a seasoned, battle-hardened warrior to duty. It was a purely economic, cynical calculation that nevertheless guaranteed soldiers first-class medical care. For those who lost limbs, local craftsmen fashioned crude wooden prostheses so that people could at least walk on their own. Such war invalids were honorably discharged, receiving a substantial plot of land as a state pension. They returned to their native Italian villages as living legends, living proof of the empire's cruelty and grandeur. But many of them suffered from what we now call severe post-traumatic stress disorder. While doctors worked tirelessly to save the lives of their own, the army leadership was dealing with a completely different, more cynical problem. We are talking about thousands of prisoners taken alive who waited in fear for their future, extremely unenviable fate. In the ancient world, a defeated enemy instantly ceased to be a human being and became a valuable and easily tradable commodity. And the economy of this horrific living commodity was the cornerstone of the Roman Empire's entire financial prosperity. The fate of prisoners captured on the battlefield was the darkest and most inhumane chapter of any ancient military campaign. The moment an enemy dropped his weapon and raised his hands, he forever lost all his human rights. He officially became a talking tool, an object that the victor could sell, give away, or kill with impunity for entertainment. And the scale of this monstrous slave trade following major Roman victories boggles the imagination of any modern economic researcher. Healthy, muscular men were valued most highly, as they were ideally suited for the hardest labor in the mines. A short and agonizing life awaited them in the dark silver mines of Spain or on grueling agricultural plantations. Those who stood out for their particular ferocity and tall stature were often purchased by special agents for the famous gladiator schools. Dying in the Colosseum arena to the delight of the roaring crowd was considered a more prestigious fate than rotting away in the quarries. Women and children were also sold en masse at auction, becoming domestic servants in wealthy Roman villas. Their fate was slightly easier physically, but they remained forever the powerless property of their arrogant masters. Artisans and literate people were valued much higher than ordinary peasants, and their fate was often relatively bearable. The modern job market, with its grueling interviews, seems like a ridiculous joke compared to these slave auctions. The sale of tens of thousands of slaves brought the commander and the Roman treasury absolutely astronomical, fabulous sums of money. War in Rome was not merely a matter of honor or survival. It was the most profitable state business venture. A single successful campaign in Gaul could enrich a commander so greatly that he could buy himself supreme power. Julius Caesar captured and sold into slavery about 1 million people to pay off his colossal political debts. For the legionnaires themselves, capturing prisoners was also an excellent way to earn a substantial supplement to their basic pay. For every living barbarian brought back to camp, a soldier received a percentage of his final sale price. This was a powerful financial incentive not to kill a fleeing enemy, but to try to capture him alive. Capitalism in its wildest, most primitive, and most inhumane form worked perfectly on the battlefields of antiquity. Surprisingly, it was precisely this constant influx of free labor that made Rome such a great and powerful state. Slaves built the famous aqueducts, laid the eternal roads, and erected grandiose marble temples throughout Europe. The economy of the vast empire would have simply collapsed overnight if the legions had stopped supplying this living commodity. And this is the harsh and uncomfortable truth that Hollywood historical films don't like to portray. But what was it like for the legionnaires themselves to live in this constant atmosphere of extreme violence, death, and brutal slave trade? How did ordinary people, yesterday's Italian farmers, cope with the monstrous daily psychological strain of professional warfare? The Romans did not know the terms of psychology, but they saw perfectly well how war forever changes people's souls and minds, and they had their own, very specific methods of coping with the inevitable madness of war. Constantly being at the epicenter of bloody carnage inevitably leaves deep and incurable scars on anyone's psyche. Roman legionaries served for 25 long years, and during that time they witnessed things that drove them mad. In the modern world, soldiers undergo long months of rehabilitation and work with experienced psychiatrists after difficult deployments. The Romans, however, had only the harshest discipline and grueling, exhausting daily labor instead of professional psychological help. Commanders understood perfectly well that if soldiers were given too much free time, they would begin to lose their minds from their memories. Idleness in a military camp was considered the primary and most dangerous enemy of the morale of any combat unit. Therefore, legionnaires were constantly forced to train, march, dig endless trenches, or repair their heavy weapons. The idea was that by evening, a man would be so physically exhausted that he simply wouldn't have the strength left for nightmares. The famous Roman iron discipline was not merely a means of control, but a kind of psychological anchor of stability. When the world around you turns into bloody chaos and madness, clear rules and routine help preserve what little sanity remains. Soldiers knew exactly when they would eat, when they would sleep, and exactly what they were supposed to be doing at any given moment. This strict predictability of daily life created the illusion of absolute control and safety in an incredibly hostile environment. But the most powerful therapeutic factor was the deep sense of frontline brotherhood and unconditional trust among comrades. Legionnaires lived in tents of 8, eating, sleeping, and covering for one another in formation. Your comrades were the only people in the world who could truly understand the horror you had experienced. These social bonds were stronger than steel, and they helped veterans retain their humanity in the meat grinder. Nevertheless, many legionnaires still broke under the incredible weight of what they had experienced and witnessed on the battlefields. They began drinking cheap wine incessantly, became excessively aggressive, or suffered from terrifying nighttime panic attacks. Modern medicine confidently calls this classic PTSD, but in antiquity, such soldiers were simply considered weak-spirited. Those who could not pull themselves together were mercilessly beaten with sticks or sent to penal labor units. Despite all these primitive coping mechanisms, war forever altered the personality of every Roman conscript. When veterans finally returned home after a quarter century of continuous warfare, they often could not find their place in civilian life. They were accustomed to resolving any conflict with a quick stroke of the gladius and obeying only the direct, harsh orders of their superiors. The process of returning from this bloody hell to a dull, peaceful life is a separate, extremely difficult topic. Once the battlefield had been cleared, the spoils divided, and the wounded bandaged, the illusion of rest vanished instantly. The Roman war machine could not afford long pauses for celebration or relaxed recuperation. On the third day after the massive slaughter, the legion had to be ready again for a full-scale long march. Speed of maneuver was always Rome's main tactical advantage over the sluggish barbarian hordes. Early in the morning, the sharp sounds of battle trumpets once again rang out deafeningly over the camp, rousing the weary men to their feet. The soldiers obediently folded up their leather tents, packed their heavy backpacks, and formed into orderly marching columns. Scouts often marched ahead, searching for new targets or the fleeing remnants of the enemy army. Each legionnaire would once again have to carry about 80 pounds of gear over rough roads. The most astonishing thing was that, after the horrors they had endured and the colossal physical strain, this march was considered routine. People simply shut off their emotions, turning into hardy pack mules, obediently following the one walking ahead of them. The calluses on their feet were thicker than the soles of their sandals, and their shoulders had long since grown accustomed to the cutting straps of their armor. Modern ultramarathoners trained for a long time to handle such exertions, but the Romans simply called it a typical Thursday. At the same time, their diet remained extremely meager and monotonous. Hard-grained flatbreads, a little salted lard, and sour vinegar. Ordinary rank-and-file soldiers were never entitled to any celebratory feasts on the occasion of a recent historic victory. The command believed that a hearty dinner would make the legionnaires lazy and sluggish in the event of a sudden ambush. Therefore, the army continued to eat as ascetically as during the most grueling training camps. With every kilometer they marched, the memory of the recent battle gradually faded, replaced by the monotonous drudgery of the long march. Those who had lost friends marched forward in silence, knowing that tears would not help them survive the next battle. They understood that this entire gigantic empire was held together solely by their blood-stained calluses and iron discipline, and as long as they could hold their shields and take the next step, Rome would continue to ruthlessly impose its will on the world. Ahead of them lay new cities to be destroyed, new barbarians to be conquered. The cycle of violence, cleaning up corpses, and endless marches repeated itself over and over, year after long year. Interestingly, it was precisely this grueling rhythm of life that made them absolutely invincible on the battlefield. When you overcome pain, hunger, and fatigue every single day, the sight of a raging enemy no longer causes panic. For a legionnaire, battle was simply another dirty, hard job that had to be done quickly, and they carried it out with a terrifying, robotic professionalism that left their enemies not a single chance. And so ended those dreadful 48 hours following a typical Roman victory. There were no grand speeches, salutes, or tears of joy at sunset, as they show in the movies. There was only the hard, dirty work of clearing the battlefield, the brutal division of slaves, and the endless march to the next target. And this is the very unflattering historical reality that we have tried to honestly examine together today. We're used to romanticizing history, viewing the ancient world through the beautiful prism of marble statues and philosophical treatises. We love reading about great generals and their brilliant, flawless tactical maneuvers on the battlefield. But real history always reeks of sweat, blood, cheap vinegar, and rotting flesh under the scorching sun. And to truly understand the Roman Empire, one had to look precisely at these unsightly, dirty details. Rome's genius lay not only in its ability to swing a heavy sword or form invincible tortoise formations. Its true strength lay in its astonishing ability to systematize and organize even such absolute chaos as death. They turned looting into strict accounting, the removal of corpses into a science, and pain into an everyday routine. It was precisely this frighteningly rational approach that allowed them to conquer and hold half of the known ancient world. I hope you've learned a lot today about the true cost of ancient military triumphs. The next time you see a spectacular victory scene in a movie, remember those 48 hours. If you enjoyed this in-depth and honest look at historical realities, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up. There are still many amazing discoveries ahead of us about how the systems of the past actually worked. Write in the comments which fact from today's episode you found the most insane and terrifying. Until next time, and remember, real history is always hidden in the most obscure and grim details.